Hi and welcome to Crash Course Catholicism, a podcast about Catholic teaching and why it makes sense. I'm your host, Caitlin West. Hey friends, welcome to this episode on St. John Henry Newman. So, we are doing this episode now because John Henry Newman, who is a Catholic saint, was very recently declared a Doctor of the Church by Pope Leo XIV. And when I say very recently, I mean literally like a month ago. 1st of November this year, Pope Leo XIV declared St. John Henry Newman a Doctor of the Church. So what does that mean for someone to be a Doctor of the Church? Well, this is the definition given by the Catholic Dictionary. It says, Doctor of the Church is a title given since the Middle Ages to certain saints whose writing or preaching is outstanding for guiding the faithful in all periods of the Church's history. So in other words, a Doctor of the Church is someone who is a canonized saint of the Catholic Church. So they are like a personal role model to us, as all the saints are. But on top of that, they are also a person whose writings are of spiritual benefit to the whole Church. So originally, this title was only given to a few of the early church fathers, so people like St. Gregory the Great and St. Augustine. Today, there are 38 doctors of the church in total, including people like St. Thomas Aquinas, St. John of the Cross, St. Teresa of Avila, St. Catherine of Siena, and St. Therese of Lisieux. So only 38 in the whole history of the Catholic Church, the Catholics who have ever lived, there are only 38 of them who have been declared Doctors of the Church. So that is a very significant title to be given to a saint. And John Henry Newman has recently joined that relatively short list of Doctors of the Church. So for that reason, I thought it would be a good idea to spend some time thinking about who this saint is and why he's such a significant figure for the Catholic Church. So, John Henry Newman was born in the year 1801 in London, England. Now, the year of his birth is actually quite significant because Newman was born at kind of the tail end of the Enlightenment. So why is that so important? Well, the Enlightenment had brought about a kind of radical shift in the way that people related to faith and reason and authority. So the focus of the Enlightenment was on rationalism and empiricism. In other words, there was this focus on finding kind of tangible proof for things. And the only things that we can know are the things that we can empirically prove. So a result of this focus on empiricism was the fact that people became more suspicious of faith and revelation and tradition. And there was this growing kind of sense that religion was unreasonable because it required an element of faith. And Cardinal Newman was deeply interested in this tension, and it's one of the things that he is responding to in his writing, and one of the things that comes through his focus on demonstrating the reasonableness of the Catholic faith and the idea that faith and reason go hand in hand. So he was born at the end of the Enlightenment. He was the eldest of 6 children, 3 boys and 3 girls, and he attended a school called Great Ealing School from the age of 7. Great Ealing School was like a kind of posh school. It was a bit like going to Eton. So he went to this posh school, he got a really good education. Not only did he get a really good education, but Newman was also super smart. From the age of around 14, he was reading the works of the Enlightenment thinkers, so people like Voltaire and David Hume. So from a young age, Cardinal Newman was very intelligent and very curious. He was also a Christian. He was brought up an Anglican. And this is something that he talks about in his spiritual autobiography. He says, I had a perfect knowledge of my catechism, and I was brought up from a child to take great delight in reading the Bible. So Newman was a Christian from a young age. However, even though he'd kind of absorbed Christianity from his parents, so he liked reading the Bible, he knew his catechism, Newman's faith didn't really take deep personal root in him until he was in his later teen years. So he says that despite the fact that he had been brought up a Christian, he says, I had no formed religious convictions till I was 15. And that's very typical, I think, of a lot of young people. At the age of 15, however, Newman underwent a kind of spiritual renewal that he actually describes as a conversion. So he says, "When I was 15, a great change of thought took place in me. I fell under the influences of a definite creed and received into my intellect impressions of dogma which through God's mercy have never been effaced or obscured." And there were a couple of key influences in that process of conversion. One was the influence of a man called Reverend Walter Mayers, who was an evangelical preacher, and his conversations with Newman and also his sermons influenced him and kind of opened the door to a deeper faith. As well as that, Mayers actually gave Newman a number of works by evangelical writers. So Newman started actually reading the writings of evangelical Christians, and these quite significantly influenced him and helped him to develop his faith. Interestingly, most of the writers that Newman was reading were Calvinist, and so during this period, Newman's faith took on a more Calvinist bent. So what's Calvinism? Calvinism is a form of Protestantism that is marked by its emphasis on predestination. So predestination is the idea that God has already chosen the people who will be saved, and that decision is made before you're even born. So human beings really have nothing to do with our own salvation. It's entirely God's gift, and we can't earn or influence it in any way. It is predetermined by God before we're even born. So Newman was influenced by those ideas, and he believed that he was one of those who was predestined for salvation. And he didn't believe this in a kind of puffed up, I'm so amazing, God has predestined me kind of way. Instead, that belief actually increased his humility, because he says that his focus was on the mercy of God and how incredible God is for choosing him despite the fact that he'd done nothing to deserve it. Around this time, Newman also became really interested in the early church fathers, and he was reading the works of people like St. Augustine, and that is something that would later become a really significant influence on him in his move from Anglicanism to Catholicism. So the seeds are there in the fact that he's reading the early church fathers, and he's undergoing this kind of spiritual renewal that is drawing him closer to Christ. Having said that, at this point, his relationship with Catholicism was kind of non-existent. Prior to his conversion, he didn't really know anything about the Catholic faith. He says, "No one had ever spoken to me on the subject of the Catholic religion, which I only knew by name." So he didn't know much about Catholicism, and even after his conversion, and when he sort of learned more about Catholicism, he got the impression that Catholicism was kind of superstitious and excessive. So Newman has had this conversion, he's on fire with his faith. He eventually goes to Oxford University and studies at Trinity College. However, despite the fact that he was completely brilliant and he had this amazing capacity for learning, Newman didn't actually perform very well in his final exams at university. This is probably due to the fact that he was experiencing intense pressure and perfectionism and exhaustion. The way that we might describe it today is we might say that he was suffering from burnout. Despite the fact that he didn't perform as well as he'd wanted to, Newman eventually graduated, and in 1822 he was made a Fellow of Oriel College at Oxford. So being made a fellow is it's like a formal academic post that involves teaching and service at the college. So he was working at Oriel College at Oxford, and then in 1825, so 3 years later, he was ordained an Anglican priest at the age of 24. And he ended up serving as an Anglican minister for roughly 20 years. So he's working at Oriel College, he's been ordained an Anglican priest, and then over the next kind of 7-ish years, Newman continued to teach and preach at Oxford, and he continued to read and to think and to pray. And slowly over that period of time, he started to move away from evangelical Protestantism and towards a more kind of high Anglicanism. And this marked a really significant period in John Henry Newman's life. Basically, while he was at Oxford, Newman was noticing a drift in Protestantism towards liberalism. So what does that mean? What's liberalism? Well, here's how Newman himself defined liberalism in the first address that he gave as a cardinal many, many years later. He said, "Liberalism in religion is the doctrine that there is no positive truth in religion. One creed is as good as another. It teaches that all are to be tolerated, for all are matters of opinion. Revealed religion is not a truth, but a sentiment and a taste. Not an objective fact, not miraculous, and it is the right of each individual to make it say just what strikes his fancy." So in other words, Newman is defining liberalism as a kind of relativism, really. So Newman noticed this trend and he was not about it. And it's true that at the time in England, there was this growing liberal tendency within Protestantism. And this tendency was marked by a few kind of defining features that essentially boiled down to a de-emphasis on the institutional, doctrinal, and sacramental dimensions of Christianity. So what does that mean? Well, let's go through each of those. The institutional aspects of Christianity. So liberal Protestants kind of treated the institution of the church as a social institution rather than a divinely instituted body that had authority from God to teach and to govern. So it downplayed the authority of the church. And then doctrinal. So liberal Protestants held that people shouldn't be expected to adhere strictly to like official doctrines. They argued that Christianity ultimately was just primarily about loving God, loving one's neighbor, trying to live an ethical life and a morally upright life, but you don't have to worry about all of those kind of doctrinal details. And then thirdly, the kind of sacramental or liturgical dimension. So liberal Protestants downplayed liturgy and the church's visible structures. So they emphasized personal subjectivity and like a private, individual relationship with God over official sort of church liturgy and sacraments. So that was part of that they viewed the sacraments as just symbolic expressions of faith, but not as actual channels of God's grace. And this is an approach to Christianity that is still around today. Like we can see it in some forms of evangelical Protestantism. Now, in contrast, John Henry Newman became a leading figure in a counter movement that emphasized the church's doctrine, apostolic authority, and sacramental life. Newman increasingly came to believe that personal faith also needs to involve participation in the visible church as a divinely founded institution. He also was coming to see sacramentality as something essential to Christianity. So what's sacramentality? Sacramentality means that there are outward material, kind of tangible physical signs that aren't just symbols of our faith, but they are truly the channels of divine grace. So in the Catholic Church, we have the sacraments, we have the Eucharist, we have baptism, marriage. All of these sacraments, they're not just symbols, they are actually like channels for the communication of God's grace. They are outer signs of an inner reality. So this is the way that John Henry Newman defined sacramentality. He said, material phenomena are both the type and instruments of real things unseen. So Newman became convinced that sacramentality was super important to the life of the church, as was the liturgy and institutional aspects of the church. So we might hear all of this and think, well, that sounds a lot like Catholicism, and it does. Basically, Newman was discovering the things that Catholicism had retained that Protestantism had slowly been moving away from. So at this stage, we might think that this was the point where John Henry Newman kind of started moving towards Catholicism. But actually, no. At this point, Newman was definitely still not a fan of Catholicism. In fact, in 1832, he and a friend of his traveled to Rome, and he wrote a letter home at the time in which he described Rome itself as the most wonderful place on earth, but the Roman Catholic Church as polytheistic, degrading, and idolatrous. So Newman had a lot of the kind of typical Protestant biases against the Catholic faith at this point, but he was recognizing something in Catholicism that was really valuable. So he started thinking about trying to find a middle way, or what he referred to as a via media, between Protestantism and Catholicism, something that incorporated the good things about the Catholic faith without actually conforming to Catholicism. So once he arrived back from his overseas trip, John Henry Newman became one of the leading figures in something called the Oxford Movement. So the Oxford Movement was a religious movement within the Church of England that began in the 1830s at Oxford University. Newman was one of the leaders of this movement alongside other high church Anglicans who were also mostly from Oxford University. Now, the aim of this movement was basically counter to liberalism. It was to re-emphasize the Catholic heritage of Anglicanism in response to what they saw as a growing liberalism. So it was about bringing Anglicanism back towards its historic Catholic roots. And this involved emphasizing the authority of the church, sacramentality, and liturgy. So the Oxford movement was the kind of seed or the root of what we now know as Anglo-Catholicism. So there were a few key pillars of the Oxford movement. The first was dogma and church authority. The members of this movement argued that the Church of England was part of the historic Catholic Church with an unbroken line of apostolic authority, and that faith was something that was lived through the institutional church. Secondly, a visible church with sacraments and rites. And then lastly, liturgical renewal. So they promoted a richer, more formal style of worship, reclaiming a more traditional approach to liturgy and prayer that had been downplayed by evangelical Anglicans. Now, one of the things that the members of the Oxford movement did is that they wrote essays on theology, which were also known as tracts. And these were published as pamphlets and circulated. And this series of pamphlets was called Tracts for the Times. So because of these tracts, the members of the Oxford movement became known as Tractarians. And together they composed 90 tracts over just under a decade. So the Tractarians led this movement towards a more traditional, more sacramental approach to High Anglicanism. Now, this movement caused major waves in the Church of England. Scott Hahn describes the impact of the Oxford movement as seismic. There was a lot of backlash against it in some quarters, and some people argued that the Tractarians were basically just smuggling Catholicism into Protestantism. And to be fair to them, I mean, they kind of weren't completely off the mark, because many of the key figures of the Oxford movement did actually eventually become Catholic. However, the Tractarians were genuinely trying to find that middle way between Anglicanism and Protestantism and trying to reconcile Protestantism with its kind of Catholic heritage. And in fact, even though members of this movement wanted to return to things that were very Catholic, like dogma, like sacraments, like liturgy, they still felt that the Catholic Church had kind of wandered from what it had been in its early years. They took issue with what they saw as like the over-the-top focus on Mary and the saints, for example. One of the other things that the Tractarians did is that they translated many of the works of the early church fathers, because they were trying to get back to that sort of historical rootedness of Christianity. And this became one of Newman's fascinations. He went really deep into the early church fathers, and he was convinced that all of his reading, all of his thinking, all of his prayer that he was doing was going to lead him to that via media. When in reality, what he started to see over the years that he spent reading and writing and praying as part of the Oxford movement, what he started to see was that via media was just Catholicism. That there wasn't a middle way, that it was just Catholicism. But this took time. This wasn't like a snap decision that he made or a realization that he had. It took place over a long period of time. So over the kind of 8-ish years that Newman is part of the Oxford movement, he's discovering more and more things that are sort of slowly drawing him towards Catholicism. And eventually it all culminated in this one tract that Newman wrote that was the most famous of all the tracts written during the Oxford movement. And this was called Tract 90, also titled Remarks on Certain Passages in the 39 Articles. So this was a tract written by John Henry Newman in which he commented on the 39 Articles of the Church of England. So the 39 Articles are the official doctrinal statements of the Church of England. They were established in the 16th century during the Reformation, and the whole point of them was to unify the Church of England, to have a series of statements that all Church of England adherents could agree to. And also the other aim of these 39 Articles was to distinguish the Church of England from the Roman Catholic Church and to condemn the abuses in the Roman Catholic Church. So the 39 Articles is like the Church of England's flag in the ground of this is what we believe and this is how we are distinct from Roman Catholicism. And these 39 Articles were incredibly important. They had to be sworn to by anyone who wanted to teach at Oxford University. They were sworn to by people in Parliament. Basically, anyone holding a public position had to swear to the 39 Articles. So they were a really big deal. Now, in Tract 90, Newman essentially argued that the Church of England's 39 Articles could actually be interpreted in a way that was fully compatible with Catholic doctrine. So he was trying to read these 39 articles in a way that was compatible with Catholic teaching. And this was his attempt to show that Anglicanism could actually legitimately be seen as a branch of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. He believed that there were three branches of the true church. There was Roman Catholicism, there was Eastern Orthodoxy, and then there was Anglicanism. Now, the reaction to Tract 90 was explosive. Many Anglican authorities believed that Newman was like twisting the articles. Anglican bishops publicly denounced the tract, as did many of the heads of colleges at Oxford University. So John Henry Newman describes the effect of the tract that he'd written in the following sentence from his autobiography. He writes, "In every part of the country and every class of society, through every organ and opportunity of opinion, in newspapers, in periodicals, at meetings, in pulpits, at dinner tables, in coffee rooms, in railway carriages, I was denounced as a traitor." So this tract had caused massive waves. And the backlash was so severe that it essentially ended Tractarianism, the Oxford movement. Cardinal Newman had to withdraw from the movement. And this marked a kind of turning point in his own life, because later he sort of reflected on this period of time and on the fact that Tract 90 was essentially the catalyst for his realization that he could no longer remain an Anglican, because it became clear to him that there was no room in the Church of England for this more Anglo-Catholic interpretation of Protestantism. So this eventually led to many members of the Oxford movement leaving the Anglican Church and becoming Catholic. So following the backlash from Tract 90, Newman's position and relationships in Oxford at the university became strained. Newman moved to a place called Littlemore, just outside Oxford. He moved there with a few like-minded friends, and for the next few years he lived an almost monastic existence, spending time in very kind of poor and sparse accommodation, praying and studying and thinking and writing. So Newman lived this way for 4 years, and slowly over that time he was becoming more and more and more convinced that he needed to become a Catholic. Eventually, one day, on the 9th of October in 1845, it all came to a head. There was an Italian priest called Father Dominic Barberi who was travelling to Belgium, and along the way he stopped at Littlemore. And as he was sitting there warming himself by the fire, John Henry Newman, who had heard that there was a priest in the building, entered the room, knelt down at the feet of the priest, and asked to be received into the Catholic Church. Father Barberi agreed, heard John Henry Newman's confession, and eventually over the next few days received him into the Catholic Church along with two of Newman's friends who were also Anglican ministers. Newman was now a Catholic, and after a period of discernment he felt that God was calling him to the Catholic priesthood, so he entered a seminary in Rome, and 2 years later he was ordained a Catholic priest. He then returned to London, where he experienced a lot of personal hardship. Basically, Newman's conversion was an absolutely huge deal. It sent earthquake shockwaves through Anglican England, because Newman was a very well-known figure. He was a public intellectual, he was a member of the Anglican clergy, he was the head of the Oxford movement, he was well known for his writings, for his preaching, for his sermons, and suddenly he had converted to Catholicism. So this was a huge deal. Newman actually had to resign his position at Oxford University, and he experienced a period of what felt like total personal exile in the years that followed, because essentially Anglicans felt that he was a traitor, but also many Catholics were suspicious of him and struggled to receive him into the church because they knew him as an Anglican and as an Anglican minister. So Newman went through a period of real personal darkness. He felt like a failure. He felt like he'd been rejected by everyone. He felt very alone, and he went through a time of depression. He had a couple of jobs at this time, one at a Dublin university, one as the editor of a journal called The Rambler. Both of these positions eventually ended in part as a result of the tensions that had arisen around his conversion. So he went through a really rough time. In 1964, Newman published his spiritual autobiography, which was called Apologia pro vita sua. This work described Newman's theological journey and gave a detailed account of his conversion. Now, this book became hugely popular, and it led to a major resurgence of public admiration for Newman. And he continued to write and lecture and preach for the rest of his life. He produced many influential works such as The Idea of a University, The Grammar of Assent, on the development of Christian doctrine, and he also wrote numerous sermons and essays and letters, as well as hymns and poetry. We're actually going to end our episode today with a hymn that was written by John Henry Newman. And Newman's style was so beautiful, his writing was so brilliant, and his prose was so excellent that he became well known even outside Catholic circles for his writing. In fact, James Joyce, the famous Irish author who had a complex relationship with Catholicism, to put it mildly, once wrote in a letter that nobody has ever written English prose that can be compared with that of a tiresome footling little Anglican parson who afterwards became a prince of the only true church. In the year 1879, Newman was named a cardinal. Now, this came as kind of a surprise because John Henry Newman was not even a bishop. And that's a fun fact. I don't know if we've brought that up before, that someone can be made a cardinal even if they're not a bishop. So he was named a cardinal, and then eventually in the year 1890, so 11 years later, Cardinal John Henry Newman died of pneumonia. He was beatified by Pope Benedict in 2010, canonised in 2019 by Pope Francis, and was named a Doctor of the Church in 2025. Now, we've talked a lot in this little biography about John Henry Newman's intellectual gifts, his leadership, his poetry, his writing. But one final thing that we need to emphasize about John Henry Newman was his personal sanctity, his personal holiness. You hear it in the lyrics of the hymns that he had written, in the prayers that he writes, that Cardinal Henry Newman had a deep, profound love for our Lord. This was a man who was willing to give up everything in pursuit of the truth. His obsession with truth was basically like the center point around which his entire life revolved. Cardinal Henry Newman was in love with truth, and he spent his whole life pursuing it, even when it meant giving up everything that he loved, even when it meant giving up Oxford, which was like his favorite place in the world, and his job and his friends and his position and his reputation. He was willing to sacrifice everything in pursuit of truth, i.e., in pursuit of God. So the following is an excerpt from a prayer that John Henry Newman wrote. So the following is an excerpt from a prayer that Newman wrote called the Mission Prayer. And I encourage you, there'll be a link to it in the show notes. I encourage you to read the whole prayer and to take it to your own prayer and reflection because it's absolutely beautiful. But this is just an excerpt. He says, "Therefore, I will trust in God. Whatever, wherever I am, I can never be thrown away. If I am in sickness, my sickness may serve him. In perplexity, my perplexity may serve him. If I am in sorrow, my sorrow may serve him. He does nothing in vain." I think that's completely beautiful. Okay, great. Well, that's John Henry Newman. Next episode, we are going to be talking about Saint Nicholas, just in time for Christmas. Awesome. Okay, great. Well, until then, I hope that you have a fantastic fortnight, and I can't wait to talk to you soon. Okay, bye. Lead, kindly light, amidst the encircling gloom, lead thou me on. The night is dark and I am far from home. Lead thou me on. Keep thou my feet, I do not ask to see.